right. We have reached a milestone in the Gospel of John. We are now in the 13th chapter. And, all of the Gospel of John is special for a lot of reasons, but we're going to be entering into a section of this book that is just so full of rich teaching and just, importance of it's like every word. And I hesitate to say this, but as we get into from the 13th chapter, it's like every word of Jesus is so special. But every word of Jesus is special, wherever you read it, it is. And yet sometimes we just like, wow, this is so big that we need to really, really pay attention. And in fact, Jesus himself does that sometimes, right? Can anybody tell me, what does Jesus say to key everybody in about the fact that what I'm about to say is very important? Anybody got an idea? If you got an old King James Bible, it's there a lot. Verily, verily, I say unto you. You read that and it's like, oh, what he's about to say is like super important, right? I can remember being in classroom and at the beginning of the semester or whatever, the teacher would say, whenever I say this, you might want to write it down. Ding, 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 ding. I was like, okay, this is important. I'm probably going to need it in a test. And every time he would, then we'd write that down, and sure enough, it would show up in a test later on or whatever. So, it's kind of that deal. All right, so we're in the 13th chapter, and believe it or not, we are going to go through 17 verses of Scripture today. Breaking a record, probably, in that. Yeah, so let's read them, and then we'll back up and we'll talk about them. Okay, John chapter 13, verse 1 says, Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. Now, right off the bat, that gives you the context. Everything that Jesus is going to be talking to his disciples, his apostles about, is out of love. And that's what John is telling us here. Everything that he's going to be talking to us about is out of a heart of love. So supper being ended, some of you may see a during supper. It's perhaps a more accurate translation. Having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God, he rose from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel, and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Then he comes to Simon Peter. Peter says to him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. Well, Peter says to him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. Simon Peter then said, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Another one of those classic Peter moments, okay? Jesus answers him then in verse 10, He that is washed needs not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit. And you are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him, therefore said he, Ye are not all clean. So after he had washed their feet and taken his garments, he was set down again, and he said unto them, Know ye what I've done to you? You call me Master and Lord, and you say, Well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, The servant is not greater than his Lord, neither is he that sent greater than he that sent him. If you know these things, happy are ye if you do them. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to bury that. You got an extra one there. So, Passover. So, everybody should know, be familiar with the Feast of Passover. Somebody tell me in just a few words what that feast commemorated. The Passover feast. Okay? So just before the children of Israel were going to be delivered out of Egypt, they put blood over the doorposts, and the angel of death passed over the house, if that blood was there. Passover. And they ate a particular meal while they were doing it that night. And that instituted this festival of Passover. It was probably one of the most, if not the most important one. Understand, Jesus has been through, this is probably his third Passover that he has been with his disciples. His ministry, depending upon what you read and how you interpret it, was somewhere between 3 and 3.5 years long. And so this is probably the third time that Jesus is about to experience the Passover meal with his disciples. Of course, he also knew that it was the last time that he was going to be with them. So this presented a perfect teaching opportunity on several different levels. And so what is you and I sitting here 2,000 years later, reading about this particular night of the Passover of Jesus with his disciples, probably in that same upper room that they always gathered in. Is there anything that comes to your mind that's significant for us? Did Jesus, he kind of crossed over, stepped over a line. Do we celebrate Passover anymore? The church, No. But what do we do? What do we do? We celebrate Easter, yeah. What else do we do? Yeah, communion. He turned the Passover into communion. That was the first communion. And we didn't read all of it yet, but we'll get there. So this was a pretty momentous occasion of what Jesus was doing. It has a lot of theological implications about it. Okay, let's get into it. Setting the scene. So as I said before, the Passover was Jesus' third with them. So this is something that they had experienced with Jesus before, right? We're also told right off the bat, his hour had come. Now, have we ever heard or read that phrase before? Something about his hour? Yeah. We've read that it's not yet come. I think it's probably the first time when we started studying the Gospel of John, the first time Jesus himself used that phrase. Does anybody remember when that was? What was his first miracle? Turned water into wine. They wouldn't have appreciated it the other way around, I don't think. So he turned water into wine. But what was it? What happened before he actually did that? It's an interesting conversation he had with his mother. His mother was there. They didn't run out of water. They ran out. She realized what was going on, so she goes to her son Jesus because she knows he's got the power to fix this situation. And he says to her, "Woman, why are you asking me? My hour has not yet come." Now, I don't think I explained that as we were going through the Gospel of John of what that means. And guess what? I'm not going to explain it today because I'm not sure. I'm not sure what he meant by that. But there's this phrase that has been always coming up. My hour is not come. So it's not time. That's probably a modern day way of saying my hour is not come is it's not time yet. It's not time. And yet here now, we're told it's time. So it's time for what? How do we interpret this statement in this verse? It's time for what? Well, okay. Let's let Scripture speak for itself. What does it say? It says, his hour was come. What was he talking about? That he should depart out of this world unto the Father. So that's part of it. And then I think it continues the whole thought that Jesus knew his time had come. If we jump down to verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God. What does this tell you about what was in the mind of Jesus Christ at this time? Does it say anything to you? I'm sorry, no? The cross? He knew he had to do it. He knew what was coming.
It's exciting to be going home, and he was going home.
Yeah. Hebrews tells us that Jesus endured the cross, despising the shame, because he was focused on something different. He was focused on the end results. He was focused on what he was going to accomplish. And he saw it in his mind. Now, this also is like, what was it? Sometimes God tells us what's coming in a general sense, and sometimes he doesn't, and it's a complete surprise. I'm not sure which one I prefer, to be honest with you. I've joked, I think I've told you this before. I used to joke with my mom when I was in EMS especially, because I see so many people suffer before they die. And I tell my mom, I hope I get hit by a bus. As long as I don't see it coming. And she'd say, Mark, how dare you say something like that? Well, why would I say that? Because I don't want to suffer. But I don't know what my destiny is. There may be a lot of suffering up until the point of death. Now, I believe that for children of God, once you reach that point where God is coming to take you, all the pain goes away. I've seen that. I've experienced that in the face of other people when they pass from this life to the next. But there may be a lot of suffering up until then. Sometimes he would tell his prophets how great a job they were going to do. No. Was it Jeremiah? That he basically told Jeremiah, listen, this is what I want you to do, but I'm telling you right now, you're going to be a complete washout. You're going to have zero success. Wow. Thanks. Thanks for pumping me up, Lord, and giving me that motivation or whatever, because I'm not going to be successful in what you want me to do. But it was all part of his plan. Later on, we're going to read about Peter asking Jesus a question just before he goes back up to heaven about somebody else. It was about John. Because the Lord just told Peter, there's going to come a day in which, because what we picture, and he probably was, Peter was a pretty big, strong, burly guy. And Jesus told him, but there's coming a time in which somebody else is going to lead you along because you can't even go on your own. It's like they're going to take you by the hand and take you where you need to go. And Peter asked the Lord, well, what about John? And the Lord basically told him, don't worry about John, you worry about you. So, there's all kinds of things that happen in a person's life. But Jesus, he went into this knowing, okay, it's time. And all the things we're about to... Now, what is the first... Obviously, there's a lot of things that were transpiring in the section that we're reading today. And I got to hurry up and get back to that. But what was about to happen, even that same night, the same night that Jesus washes the disciples' feet, what would happen later on? he betrayed him in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was arrested, and boy, the ball's rolling then. Everything's starting to happen. That's the kind of time frame that we are in, okay? So he was looking forward to the finished task. The finished task. And that's what I mentioned, and I'll just read it for you very quickly in Hebrews chapter 12. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher. He was determined to finish. The author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is now set at the right hand of the throne of God. So he saw the joy beyond the cross of accomplishing the atonement for the sins of all mankind. Okay, his actions were, as we said, expressions of love. I love the way John writes. Having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. Jesus never stopped loving them. And guess what? You can say the same for you if you are a believer. Jesus never stops loving you regardless. But John always is careful to be truthful. And part of the truth was, at this moment, there was a traitor among them. At this moment, there was. Now, I've heard different, theological debates about this. Judas was there, right? That's what John tells us here. He says, where's the first time he said it? In verse 2. So, supper being ended, the devil having put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Now, to get the absolute full picture of everything that's going on here, it's beneficial, which we don't have time to do today, to put all of the Gospels together to get the complete picture of what's going on. But the debate is, was Judas there during the actual Passover, which now is the new covenant communion? Was he there during that period of time? And I am inclined to say no. He was not there during that period of time, because Jesus said, one of the things that he said was that I'm not going to partake of this supper, the bread my body, the wine my blood. I'm not going to partake of this again with you until I come again. If Judas was there, that would not have been true for everybody. So that's one thing. So, but there was a point in which they were just generally having a meal, and then Jesus institutes the new communion. And I think by that time Judas was out of there. Okay, Judas was ready to betray Christ. He very well may have already been paid. He may have already had that money in his pocket, and now it was time for him to go and tell the guys of the Sanhedrin where Jesus was going to be. And he knew where Jesus was going to go, because Jesus was kind of a man of habit. He liked to go to the Garden of Gethsemane afterwards, and that's exactly what happened. Judas is ready to betray Christ. And then John makes sure and tells us that the Father puts all authority and responsibility in the hands of Jesus. It's all up to him. So understanding the Trinity is tough. And we know that it's the Father's plan, so to speak. And Jesus is there to make sure that the Father's plan is fulfilled. And of course, the Spirit of God is in Christ, is in the Father. It's, and they're all one, and yet they're three all at the same time. And yet, in a very unique way, everything about God's ultimate redemption plan for everybody is in the hands of Jesus. He's given all authority and responsibility. It's up to him. What did Jesus say one time that he could have done that he didn't do in order to avoid being crucified? He could have called 10,000 legions of angels. He could have done that. It was up to him whether or not he was going to fulfill the ultimate plan, the master plan of the Father. And so here it is. We're ready. So now what happens? We get to see humbleness on display. So Jesus takes off his outer garment, wraps a towel around his waist, has the basin. So now what do we know about first century and how foot washing played out in the first century here? What do we know about it? Yeah, so most people wore open-toed footwear, sandals, and they walked everywhere, and so they got really dirty, and so it was a custom, right? Now, if you went into somebody's house, who was it usually that did the washing of the feet? Servants. Slaves. If they had more than one slave, which slave got the foot washing duty? Yeah, the lowly one, the plebe, whatever you want to, the one with the least amount of whatever you want to call it. Seniority, low man on the totem pole, Nobody looked forward to that duty. Now, if there was not a slave, the guests themselves might actually wash their own feet. But it was proper to do that before you went into the person's house because their feet were nasty dirty. Now, there are some people that have a peculiar relationship with feet. I don't know if you were like that, but there's some people that just like, I don't know what it is. The thought of, there's some, let me put it this way, there's some people that could never be a podiatrist. Thought of touching somebody else's foot, no. So this was something that was expected, and of course they were there. They didn't have any slaves there, and they had already been there for some time. There was a washing, a bowl of water, and what do you think might have been going on in the minds of the 12 guys initially that were there? Yeah? Or, who's going to do this? Nobody stepped up, did they? Nobody stepped up and volunteered to have the duty of foot washing. And so when Jesus got up, took off his outer garment, put a towel around him, grabbed that bowl. If you're sitting there, what are you thinking? What's going on? Do you believe this? I can hear Peter whispering to James or John, no, he's not actually going to do this, is he? And yet he begins to wash everybody's feet. Now, nobody's saying anything, right? He's washing their feet. Until he comes to who? To Peter. Now, I don't know if Peter was the last one or not. Perhaps it was. Perhaps Peter was the last guy. And Peter begins to have a real serious conversation, which we'll get to later. I'm jumping ahead of myself. So, he laid aside his garments. Now, this term, laid aside, just really struck me, and my mind went immediately to Philippians chapter 2. Somebody look that up for me. Read it for us. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. Keep going.
But made himself no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men.
Okay. Did you hear what Paul is telling us about Jesus? He said, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. In other words, I want you to have the same attitude that Jesus had. Well, what attitude did Jesus have? Well, before he left heaven to become a human being, he didn't make being in heaven and existing in heaven as God with the Father something so special, something so important, something so amazing that he was not willing to leave that. So he was willing to leave heaven, and he humbled himself. He became a human being. He became a man. So what was Jesus doing? He was laying aside. What did Jesus lay aside when he became a human being? Yeah, that's part of it, yeah. Just think about of who he was. He laid aside the outward expression of who he actually was. And humble himself by becoming a human being. And when he became a human being, what did he become in the very, very beginning? A baby. He was an infant. Completely, what is it? I can't think of the word right now. Dependent, thank you. Completely dependent. All you have to do to kill an infant is leave it alone. That's all you got to do. They will die. They need everything. Now, it's been a long time since I had an infant in my household. But, what do when they need something? They cry. And pretty soon you can begin to interpret the cry. What kind of cry it was, and it is. And then, yeah. And then you say, okay, what are the things that you go to first to figure out why the baby's crying? Do they need the diaper changed? Do they need food? Right? And if it's not one of those two things, then that's what I used to do as a father. I go, uh-oh. What else? And you try to figure out what they need. Well, yeah, obviously, yeah. My oldest daughter, we got in a car. She started crying. We got in a car. We're heading to my folks' house in Anaheim, California. And she started screaming at the top of her lungs, and we could not figure out what was going on with her. And she screamed for 2.5 hours. We pulled up in front of my dad's house. My dad was home alone. And he saw us pull up, and he came out of the, she must have been she was walking 2 years old maybe. And my wife opens the door, and my dad's walking up, and she goes, "Here!" And he grabs her, and as soon as he put her in his arms and started walking her, she shut up. She shut up. Well, she didn't want to be in the car. That was obvious. Now, the other thing that came out is that in a few hours later, she broke out into this most beautiful roseola that you've ever seen in your life. And that's what was going on, I think. She was coming down with that. And but it was just so dramatic. As soon as we handed her to my dad, boom. For 2.5 hours. I was like, ah. That's when I lost all my hair, that day. I don't even know how I got to that story. But anyway, life has its challenges, and we have all these things that happen to us. And Jesus, he was willing to lay aside all of his glory, just like he laid aside his garment, wrapped himself in a towel, and began washing the disciples' feet. He stripped himself of outward glory. That's what Philippians 2 is teaching us. He willingly did that. And now he's showing them another vivid, living example of his willingness to strip himself of what is rightfully his due. And we're going to learn about that as he talks about it. He took upon the appearance of a slave, because it was usually a slave that did the foot washing. So he took upon the appearance of a slave. Once again, I think his disciples were dumbfounded at this. They were so amazed, and it comes into play with part of the reason, or the biggest reason, of why they reacted the way they did once he got arrested. And so we'll talk about that when we get there. So he kneeled before each one of them, right? I've entitled this lesson, "The God Who Kneels." He kneeled before them as a servant, as a slave, and washed their feet. Lovingly, willingly washed their dirty feet. Jesus has never saved somebody who doesn't need it. He said that himself. If you don't need my salvation, I didn't come for you. Now, what's the real truth? Everybody needs his salvation. But if you don't think you need to be saved, I guarantee you, you will not be saved. You have to know it. You have to know you need it. And so he came to seek and to save that which is lost. And he willingly did that and come to us with our dirty feet, so to speak. He did not demand that we change before we come to him in faith. Thank God he did not demand that we change. We can't do that. He came to us as we are. Remember one of the old invitation hymns, "Just as I am," right? That's how we come to the Lord. Okay, so Peter's lesson then. So his mindset was off. His mindset was wrong. And so what was his mindset? Let's get into this a little bit. I think he needed Jesus to be worthy of his devotion. Think about that. What had Peter done? And it was true of everybody else in that room. What had they done already?
They had given up what their occupation is.
Their former lives, man. They kissed it goodbye. They gave up everything that they had, the way they lived, to follow Jesus for 3 years. Now, if I'm going to do that, I want to be sure that the guy I'm following is worth it. Right? I think that was Peter's driving need. So if I'm going to follow somebody who's worth worship, they're going to be an awful powerful person. They're going to be somebody that's going to lead us all into some really, really great things. And for Peter to see Jesus humble himself and begin washing the disciples' feet, man, it just wasn't computing to him. And so when Jesus comes to him and Peter asks, "You're going to wash my feet?" And Jesus tries to tell him, "Now, listen, you don't totally understand what's going on right now, but you will." But Peter's adamant, "No, you'll never wash my feet." He didn't want the guy that he was following to humble himself like that in front of everybody. He was ignorant. And ignorance leads to foolishness. So he said something foolish. And then when Jesus told him Peter, if you really don't want me to wash your feet, what did Jesus tell him? That's verse, you have no part with me. Verse 8. You could put the word fellowship in there. You have no fellowship with me if you don't let me do this. Now, Peter, slapped in the face. Wow. So now he tries to double back on the other side. Well, if that's the case, don't wash my feet only, wash my head and my hands too. Right? So I think this also clues us in to some very valuable insights about, Peter didn't always say the wrong things, remember? You know, he gets a bad rap sometimes because he was the outspoken one. And sometimes being the outspoken one, yeah, it was Peter that was saying these things, but don't you think that the other guys weren't thinking it, just not saying it? Yes, Nancy.
Do you think Peter felt like he himself wasn't worthy?
Was what?
That he himself was not worthy to have Christ wash his feet? I guess that's the way I always felt.
Well, yeah, that can be. I can also see pride in Peter in this too, though. I can see some pride in him that he wasn't the same as the other guys. But I think both of those things can be true too. But the one thing that I'm quite sure of is that Peter was devoted to Jesus Christ. He was devoted to him. Sorry, I don't know what I touched my phone. He loved him. And so Jesus tells Peter the truth. Fellowship with Christ requires foot washing. You want to be in fellowship with Jesus, it requires foot washing. Now let's talk about it. So are we, we claim to be a Bible-believing, teaching, and practicing church here. But so far, I've never come to a service of foot washing. They used to do that? Yeah. Not wrong. Not wrong. But I don't think it's a requirement. I don't think it's a church ordinance. We have two church ordinances: communion, the Lord's Supper, and baptism. Those are the two church ordinances. We don't see any first century history of the fact that Christians began a traditional ceremonial foot washing. We just don't see any evidence of that happening. So the lesson here is not about actually washing somebody's feet, scrub them between those toes, and everything. No, it's not about that. It's about the general principle of humbleness, right? And being willing to do that. And scriptures are full of this principle that we are supposed to watch out for the other guy. We're supposed to understand the needs of other people and not just understand them and know them, but respond to them as God has given us ability to do that very thing. Yes, Jim.
Another part of that has been lost in the early days of christening when they used to dip them in the river.
I don't know.
The whole body got wet.
Yeah. So, but you bring up to mind the next point here, I think, which is that fellowship with Christ requires foot washing, but we're not talking about salvation. We're talking about fellowship, ongoing fellowship. The scriptures talk about your relationship with Jesus in at least 2 or 3 different ways after you're saved. So they're not talking about your salvation. Sometimes it's fellowship with Jesus, being in complete fellowship with him. Sometimes the Bible talks about, and John uses this a lot, abiding in Jesus. You ever heard that phrase, abiding in Jesus? Be at home with him. Live with him. And being spirit-filled, being spirit-led, all those things, talking about the closeness of your relationship with the Lord after you're saved. And I think that's why Jesus tells these guys, listen, he told Peter, I don't need to wash your head or your hands. Why? So now, the only time somebody would wash their basically the whole body is what we're talking about. The only time they'd wash their whole body is if they were literally having a full bath. And, they're not like Americans these days. And there's some people that take a shower, more than once a day. And are used to that and would think, oh man, whatever. They didn't get that, right? What's the old cowboy joke? I take a bath once a month, whether I need it or not, or something. It was probably something closer to that. Well, when they took a bath, their body was clean. So then what do they need on an ongoing basis, on a regular, everyday basis? Their feet. They need to keep washing their feet. Their body was okay. And so that's what Jesus was telling Peter. You're clean. You are clean already. And that, to me, that's the security in salvation. You are, as a child of God, you are clean. But we all need our feet washed because we're walking around in a dirty world. And we pick it up. And we need to stop and remind ourselves, I need to wash my feet here. Not get saved all over again. I just need to wash my feet because I need to be in fellowship with the Lord more than in fellowship with the world. Okay, we're running out of time here. The bigger lesson, verses 12 through 17, he talked about it here, which is what? He sat down and he asked the question, do you guys understand what I just did? That was his question to everybody. And then he began to explain it. And he said, basically, listen, if I, your Lord and Master, you tell me that I'm your Lord and Master, and guess what? You're right, because I am. I am your Lord and Master. That puts him in a position of authority over them. But if I, as your Lord and Master, wash your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. And that's all about humility. Humility brings happiness. Humility brings happiness. Do you know what that word, in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, blessed, and then he would describe different things. That word blessed, do you know what that word really means? Right there. It means happy, but it also means spiritually prosperous. Spiritually prosperous. So back to Philippians chapter 2. What was the context of those statements about, what was in the mind of Christ? Why was Paul telling them this? He said it this way: let nothing be done through strife or vain glory. In other words, pride. Don't let anything be done out of selfish pride, but in lowliness of mind, humbleness. Let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. And then he gives the example of Jesus, the ultimate example of doing those things, of living a lowliness of mind and esteeming others better than himself, and being willing to be concerned with what's going on with somebody else before what's going on with yourself. So it's not just then he ends this whole section of Scripture. It's not just about believing. It's about doing. But you have to know it before you believe it. And that's what he said, right? He said, that's back in Philippians. If you know these things, happy are ye. So there's three components here: knowing, happiness, and doing. But in order to believe these things, you have to know them. If you know them, you can believe them, and then you can exercise that belief and benefit both your life and somebody else's. And you know what you're doing there? You are fulfilling the law of Christ. You're fulfilling the law. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. You're doing all those things. He will say later on in John, by this shall all men know you are my disciples, if you love each other. Amazing. Amazing the power that this brings in people's lives. So it helps you and it helps the other person that you're interacting with in life. All right. That's it. Let's see, announcement. There is a washer, dryer, and an ironing board available. If you know anybody that needs any of those items, talk to Tina about that. And prayer requests. Yes.
Yes, traveling for our daughter Sarah and our granddaughter Alexandra to Yellowstone. Our granddaughter is an internship in Yellowstone for 3 months.
Oh, cool. All right. All right. Let's pray for them as they travel. Jim, you had one, I know. Prayer request? No? Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, Lord impressed it. You know, that is true. You know, we worry about our kids in so many different ways, and thinking about which direction our world is heading in, we worry about our children. But the good thing is that the Lord watches over those kids, too, at the same time. Yeah. Anything else? Brian, would you mind taking us out today?